Peter Zihan's analysis of global trends. Peter Zihan, a well-known geopolitical analyst and author, often discusses global trends through the lens of geography, demographics, and economics. Here are some key global trends that Zihan frequently addresses, extrapolated for 2024. 1. Demographic shifts. Zihan emphasizes the impact of demographic changes on global economies. Aging populations in developed countries, coupled with declining birth rates, are expected to strain social welfare systems and labor markets. Conversely, some developing nations with younger populations may experience economic growth, but also face challenges related to unemployment and social unrest. 2. Geopolitical realignments. Zihan predicts significant geopolitical shifts as nations recess alliances and trade relationships. The weakening of global institutions like the EU and the United Nations may lead to more bilateral and regional agreements. He often highlights the strategic repositioning of the United States, focusing on energy independence and shifting military priorities. 3. Energy independence and transition. Zihan discusses the impact of the EU becoming more energy independent due to advancements in shale, oil and gas extraction. This shift reduces the EU's reliance on foreign oil, particularly from the Middle East, and has broad implications for global energy markets. Additionally, the transition to renewable energy sources continues to gain momentum, driven by both policy and technological advancements. 4. Supply chain realignments. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in global supply chains, leading to a reevaluation of manufacturing and sourcing strategies. Zihan suggests that companies and countries will increasingly prioritize regional and domestic production to enhance supply chain resilience, impacting global trade dynamics. 5. Technological advancements. Technological innovation, particularly in automation, AI, and biotechnology, will continue to transform economies and labor markets. Zihan points out that these advancements can lead to greater efficiency and productivity, but also require significant adjustments in workforce skills and employment patterns. 6. China's economic and political trajectory. Zihan often analyzes China's economic strategies and political stability. He argues that China's economic growth faces significant challenges due to demographic issues, mounting debt, and geopolitical tensions. The country's aggressive foreign policy, particularly in the South China Sea and toward Taiwan, remains a critical focus area. 7. Deglobalization trends. Zihan notes the trend towards deglobalization, where countries increasingly focus on national interests and economic self-sufficiency. This shift is driven by political populism, trade disputes, and concerns over economic dependency on other nations. 8. Climate change and environmental policies. The global response to climate change continues to shape policies and economic strategies. Zihan highlights the growing emphasis on sustainable practices, green technologies, and international agreements aimed at reducing carbon emissions. 9. Urbanization and infrastructure development. Urbanization trends continue to drive infrastructure development in both developed and developing countries. Smart cities, public transportation, and sustainable urban planning are key focus areas, addressing the needs of growing urban populations and environmental concerns. 10. Global health initiatives. The ongoing effects of the COVID-19 pandemic have heightened the importance of global health initiatives. Zihan discusses the increased focus on healthcare infrastructure, vaccine distribution, and international cooperation to manage future health crises. By understanding these trends, as analyzed by Peter Zihan, individuals, businesses, and policymakers can better prepare for the evolving global landscape in 2024 and beyond. Deep global leadership according to Peter Zihan. Peter Zihan, a renowned geopolitical strategist, provides insightful analysis on global leadership through the lenses of geography, demographics, and economics. Here's a synthesis of his views on global leadership trends and dynamics as we move into 2024. 1. United States. Peter Zihan often highlights the United States' unique position due to its favorable geography, demographic trends, and energy independence. He argues that the U.S. is likely to maintain its leadership role for several reasons. Energy independence, advances in shale oil and gas have made the U.S. less reliant on foreign energy sources, strengthening its economic and geopolitical position. Military strength. The U.S. continues to have unmatched military capabilities, enabling it to project power globally. Economic resilience. With a robust economy and innovation-driven industries, the U.S. remains a global economic leader. Zihan emphasizes that the U.S. geographic isolation provides a natural defense, while its demographic trends support economic growth. The combination of abundant natural resources and technological innovation ensures that the U.S. can sustain its energy needs domestically. Additionally, the U.S. military's global reach and technological superiority allow it to influence international affairs effectively. Overall, these factors contribute to the United States' continued dominance in the global arena. 2. China. Peter Zihan provides a more cautious view on China's global leadership aspirations. Demographic challenges, an aging population and shrinking workforce pose significant long-term challenges for China, potentially leading to slower economic growth and increased social welfare burdens. Economic risks, high levels of debt, and potential economic instability could undermine China's growth prospects. The reliance on state-driven investments and the risk of a real estate bubble are significant concerns. Geopolitical tensions, aggressive policies in the South China Sea, along with tensions with neighboring countries and the West, create geopolitical risks that could limit China's influence. These actions may lead to regional conflicts and strained international relations, impacting China's trade and diplomatic standing. Zihan notes that while China has made remarkable economic advancements, these internal and external challenges may hinder its ability to achieve and sustain global leadership. The combination of demographic issues, economic vulnerabilities, and geopolitical friction poses significant obstacles for China's future aspirations on the global stage. 3. European Union. The EU faces internal and external challenges that impact its global leadership. Demographic decline. Many EU countries are grappling with aging populations and low birth rates, which could slow economic growth and strain social welfare systems. This demographic shift may reduce the labor force and increase the burden on younger generations to support an aging population. Political fragmentation. Rising nationalism and political fragmentation within the EU hinder cohesive policymaking and weaken its global stance. The diverging interests of member states can lead to policy gridlock, undermining the EU's ability to act decisively on international issues and diminishing its influence on the global stage. Energy dependency. The EU's dependency on external energy sources, particularly from Russia, poses strategic vulnerabilities. This reliance makes the EU susceptible to energy supply disruptions and geopolitical pressures, impacting its economic stability and security. Efforts to diversify energy sources and enhance energy independence are crucial for mitigating these risks. These challenges collectively impact the EU's capacity to maintain and expand its global leadership role, addressing demographic issues, fostering political unity, and reducing energy dependency are essential steps for the EU to strengthen its position in the international arena. 4. Russia. Zihan notes Russia's efforts to reassert its influence, especially in its near abroad military actions. Russia's military interventions in Ukraine and Syria highlight its willingness to use force to achieve geopolitical objectives. Energy leverage. Russia uses its vast energy resources as a tool of influence, particularly over Europe. Economic limitations. Despite these efforts, Russia's economic base remains relatively weak, limiting its ability to project long-term global power. 5. Other emerging powers. Zian also examines the roles of other emerging powers like India and Brazil. India, with a large young population and a growing economy. India has the potential to increase its global influence. However, it faces challenges like infrastructure deficits and internal social issues. Brazil, rich in natural resources and with a large agricultural sector, Brazil has regional influence but struggles with political instability and economic volatility. 6. Global power shifts. Zihan often emphasizes the shift towards a multipolar world, where no single country dominates. Regional powers, countries like Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are becoming more influential within their regions, shaping local geopolitics. Non-state actors, multinational corporations, and international organizations play increasingly significant roles in global affairs, often filling leadership voids left by states. 7. Technology and innovation. The race for technological leadership is a critical aspect of global power. AI and cybersecurity. Dominance in AI and cybersecurity is becoming crucial for national security and economic competitiveness. Space exploration. Leading nations and private companies are pushing the boundaries of space exploration, aiming to establish a strategic presence in space. 8. Environmental leadership. Climate change and sustainability are emerging as key areas of global leadership. Renewable energy. Countries leading in renewable energy
Hey everybody, Peter Zion here, coming to you from Colorado. A lot of you have been writing in and asking for scenarios of what the Chinese system will look like as it collapses. And Chinese history is rich with how it's all gone to hell. So putting my finger on one specific scenario, I don't think is very useful. But a lot of you have also written in asking about the Chinese housing market. And I think kind of exploring these two things hand in hand is worth a little bit of time. So the Chinese follow a capital intensive investment model. There's three types of economic growth. You've got consumption, like you go out and you buy a home or you buy an iPod or whatever it happens to be. In the United States, that's about 70% of total economic activity, private consumption. Then you have exports. So, you make something like Boeing and you sell it to the Indians, export-led economic growth. That is a system that is more popular in a place like, say, Korea or Germany. And then you have investment-led economic growth, which is the building of stuff. Regardless of where you get the capital, you go out and you build a road, you build a factory, something like that. And this has always been the method that has been favored in China and to a lesser degree all of East Asia, because it's something the government for the most part can control, and it tends to be directed towards things that the government feels needs to be done. So roads, bridges, industrial plant. And all of the East Asians have followed this pattern to a certain degree. The problem with this pattern this type of growth is if you do it enough, you start to distort the economy and you absorb more and more capital and more labor and more resources. And eventually you get to the point where there's diminishing returns because you only need so many roads, you only need so many factories. In the case of Japan, they reached this point in the 1980s, and they went from having stratospheric growth because this generates a lot of economic activity to just kind of a stall out. And they were left with a stack of loans worth about 50% of their GDP, $2 trillion at the time, that was invested into assets that probably should have never been built in the first place. And it took the Japanese system 30 years to churn through that. And that was 30 years of basically not having economic growth at all. Eventually, they realized the debt burden was so bad that they needed to focus what they could do on more productive stuff. And that turned out to be stuff that was not in Japan. And so we started this generation long outsourcing, desourcing, whatever you want to call it, to countries that had better demographics and better debt profiles, most notably the United States. And here we are now, 35 years after that process started, and the Japanese economy is more or less back in health, but it's happened as the demographic situation is turned inside out. So consumption-led growth in Japan will probably never happen again. They're just too old. Something similar went down in Korea. But the Koreans attacked it with a fervor that the Japanese couldn't muster, and they decided to deal with it by investing more, but going further and further up the value-added chain. And this could work in Korea because they were already among the most highly educated populations in the world. And it eventually generated things like the Samsung and the Daewoo and the Hyundai that we know today. It came at a cost, extraordinary levels of turnover in their corporate world as entire chaebol, which are kind of giant industrial conglomerates, would go bust, which would generate a huge surge of unemployment and credit risk, which the government had to step in and assume the risk of itself. In China, it has done something similar to both of these, as well as a third one. So first, building bridges to nowhere. The Chinese absolutely reached that level probably back in the early 2010s, and most of the construction we've seen across China is of questionable economic use, and the debt has been building up. Corporate debt has basically doubled since 2010, and it started at a level that was already in excess of American debt. So, we're talking about a huge amount of money that has been put into things that probably are never going to have a return. They tried to follow the Korean model as well, but what they discovered is that their workforce was already fairly unproductive. And while overall productivity for the Chinese labor forces have gone up by 50 to 100% in the last 10 to 15 years, the debt load has gone up by a factor of 5. So from a cost benefit point of view, Chinese labor has actually decreased in terms of its overall productivity once you consider the cost, because in that time frame, the cost of Chinese labor has gone up by more than a factor of 5 or 6. And then there's a third model. Unlike Japan, unlike Korea, which are, for the most part, private enterprise driven systems, the Chinese are absolutely state centric. And in Korea and Japan, the people always had options for where to put their own personal money to make their bets on their futures, prepare for their own retirement, expand their own wealth. The Chinese don't have that. Capital flight is strictly regulated, in many cases forbidden, and every time that the people find a new way to get money out, the Chinese government changes the law, and so it all gets bottled up at home. Now, for the Chinese development model, this has proven successful at keeping the Chinese citizens' money as part of the process that then funds all of that investment. So whereas in Japan, it's a mix of corporate, and Korea, it's a mix of corporate and government, in China, the average citizen in many ways is being forced to help underwrite all this bad debt. And the Chinese citizens don't really appreciate that, as you might expect. And so they're always looking for outlets. Now, they can't send their money abroad, so they're looking for outlets at home. And so China is famous for massive speculative bubbles that happen in commodities or gold or anything. And the one that has proven the most problematic and the one that has generated the most economic growth to this point has been housing. The government does allow you to own your own home. So people did that with gusto. And then they started buying apartments and second apartments and third apartments and fourth apartments. And basically, we got an Enron style financial boom driven by growth in construction of the housing sector. Now, the new news that has come out in just the last few days that kind of crystallized this all for me. So there's a dude in China by the name of He King, great name, who used to be an uppity up in the Chinese Statistics Bureau. And his estimate now is that there's more housing units available that are unoccupied in China, so many available that they could house the entire Chinese population. So we're talking an overbuild in excess of 100%. Quick addendum, I did a quick fact check before we went to print with this one, print release, whatever, on Mr. He's data that he estimates that there are sufficient empty apartments to house the entirety of the Chinese population. That was wrong. He says there's sufficient spare housing to house twice the Chinese population. So everything I said before stands, just underline most of it. To kind of put that into perspective, the American subprime crisis at its peak had less than 5% overbuild because of subprime, probably closer to 3%. And it was only because we bound up those mortgages with more healthy real estate investments in asset backed securities that it actually turned into a big crisis. And we all know how that felt here. Ultimately, we had a financial crisis that lopped 5% off of GDP. If in China you're talking 100% overbuild in a country that is suffering from the advanced stages of terminal demographic decline and is already experiencing massive population losses against in the United States where we had less than a 5% overbuild and we still had population growth and inward migration, the mind reels in coming up with a historical precedent here because there isn't one. In time, the Korean, the Japanese models were able to mostly recover from the overbuild, in part because private citizens were not wrapped up in the damage. This time around in China, this specific aspect of the overbuild, which is the biggest in human history, isn't even reflected in the debt data because a lot of Chinese have been able to pay for these apartments with cash. And they now have invested, for the most part, their total life savings in an asset that is probably worth at most a quarter of what they paid for it. So in Japan, in Korea, national coherence, public support for the very existence of the government was never damaged because people's finances were only hit indirectly because of economic growth issues. But in China, you're talking about a complete wipeout for what, for most Chinese citizens, is their primary and maybe even only method of savings. On top of a failure of the Korean style expansion to improve productivity, on top of a failure of the Japanese style program to improve public infrastructure. This is going to hit them from every possible angle when it breaks, and it's going to do so by ripping the heart out of public support for the entire system and the CCP and the government in particular. So no, I am not particularly optimistic about how this is going to shake out.